One of the first people we need to mention was Freud's, for a long time, considered heir apparent, and his name was Carl Jung. Jung was a student of Freud's. In fact, Freud had tagged him to be his successor. Freud even gave Jung a very special ring to indicate how wed they were together, in theory and in behavior. Freud thought that Jung was great because he could articulate his ideas very well. He seemed in full support of a lot of the concepts that Freud had originally presented. And indeed, Jung, on his part, did agree with a lot of Freud's ideas. He believed in the break between the unconscious and the conscious. He believed that past experiences, and our very distant past, did shape who we were. But as Freud began speaking about his own ideas, adding the psychosexual stages of development, Jung started to back away. Jung started to even come up with his own ideas and theories about what the unconscious was actually comprised of. And when Jung did this, Freud got very upset. In fact, it caused a very, what we call, messy breakup in their relationship. As the story goes, when Freud found Jung introducing his new ideas at a new university, he actually left his university, traveled to where Jung was, went to his place where he was staying, and demanded that Jung give the ring back, in essence, severing the relationship between Freud and Jung. When this happened, it allowed Jung to really have the ability to start pursuing his own ideas, to introduce his own concepts of what caused a person to be the way they were. The first thing he argued was that when we talked about the unconscious, Freud was just wrong. It was not part of the id and the superego, but instead, our unconscious, our strivings, our recognition of things, are primarily based on what he called archetypes. These unconscious characters, individuals, themes that he said were inherent within all of us. And he argued that these concepts, like a good mother or a spiritual being, were something that were passed down from generation to generation. In essence, they were a part of our biology that we didn't necessarily have to learn. And he thought that these characters, these individuals, shaped us in ways that we were completely unaware of. But nonetheless, even though we didn't recognize them, just like with Freud's idea of the unconscious, they affected our big behaviors and our small daily behaviors. Now, just like Freud, Jung didn't have a lot of research to support his ideas. But when he broke from Freud, this opened the doors for other people to start exploring their own concepts of the unconscious and of personality. One of the first people to do this was the man that was very similar to Carl Jung. This person's name was Carl Rogers. Just like Jung, he believed very strongly in this spiritual aspect to each individual. But when he focused on spirituality, he focused a lot on the positive aspects of a person's innate being. He argued that when we look at individuals, what we see is a person that's formed themselves into a person that's trying to achieve the greatest thing that they can have possibly become. A level of being that he called self-actualization, where we move effectively, we think clearly, and we essentially reach our full potential of who we could be as a human being. In Rogers' mind, our personality was our attempt to find a way to get the person that we thought we were to align with this individual that we theoretically were always striving to become. In essence, to become self-actualized, what we would need is our actual self to line up with this ideal self that we had in our minds. Now, one of Rogers' followers, E. Torrey Higgins, actually came up with a new idea of something called the ought self, the person that we think we should be. Higgins argued that this was another component in making us, or I guess allowing us to become self-actualized. It's not Rogers' idea, but the big thing I want you to get from this is this notion of selves. And that maybe when we're talking about personality, it's the fact that we're striving to be something great, not trying to avoid some negative consequence or negative thing from our past. Rogers' work kind of spurred on other people to look at his new branch of psychology that he called humanistic psychology. One of the first people to really be attracted to this was a Russian man. This Russian man's name was Abraham Maslow. And Maslow very strongly believed in the research of Rogers. But when he looked at self-actualization, he thought that instead of just having selves aligned, we actually were only allowed, or only had the capability of working on these selves when other things were met. Namely, what we needed to do is have specific needs substantially taken care of in order to pursue this level of self-actualization that Rogers had proposed. Maslow introduced something that's very popular in high school, sometimes you'll see it on TV, called the hierarchy of needs. He said, for us to ever become self-actualized, what we first need to do is get each of our substantial lower needs taken care of. He said the first need we have is physiological. So if we need air, water, food, warmth, all of these things dominate our attention. In fact, if those things aren't met, we can't pursue anything else. But if we're taken care of, we can pursue the next level of attainment, namely safety. Do I feel safe? Do I feel comfortable? And if so, we move on. If not, that becomes the primary focus. If we do feel safe, we get to pursue love. Am I loved? Do I have people around me that love me? Is another big question that he said has to be met. Then afterwards, not only do we want to pursue the respect of others and love of others, but we also want to pursue our own respect. So we pursue something called esteem, where we can be considered in high esteem not only by other individuals, but by ourselves as well. And once that happens, once all those needs are met, we can pursue self-actualization. Maslow argued that in each given day, every minute, we're fluctuating up and down this hierarchy of needs. But for the person to truly become self-actualized, they must have all their first primary needs met before they can pursue this goal that Rogers introduced in his theory. This research by Rogers and all of the other people that we talked about so far has always had a major problem. And that's the fact that even though it was very intricate, very neat and attractive, there seems to be no substantial evidence to support any of the theories that we've discussed so far. The next person we're going to talk about, named George Alexander Kelly, started changing that. In essence, he altered the conversation and started trying to encourage us to think more like scientists when trying to explain personality. His original work was in clinical psychology. In fact, he was originally a school psychologist, where his job was to look at children who were struggling with problems, deal with teachers, deal with administration, to try to help people overcome some of the problems that they were encountering. When trying to do this, as Kelly was pursuing his career, he started to recognize that there was a major problem with a lot of the individuals that he was dealing with. Namely, it wasn't that kids were behaving poorly and he needed to fix it, but that kids, teachers, administration, parents, all seemed to be seeing the world in very different ways. And he thought each perception greatly shaped the way they interpreted the behavior of kids, greatly shaped the way they interpreted the environment, and caused very dramatic differences from person to person. He later went on to call these differences in perception constructs. This idea of constructs is very similar to the ideas of schemas that we talked about with Piaget. But in Kelly's idea, Constructs were people's ways of predicting how to interact with the world, what to do when they encountered specific things. So, like an example of a construct that somebody could create is a construct of, say, a tree. We could say, if I see this, I know it's good for shade, or I know it might have leaves on it. In essence, by creating that rule, we can know what to pursue, what to avoid when the construct of tree is activated. And he said some constructs, like a tree, are fairly easy, very unambiguous, but others can become a little bit harder to pinpoint. If I say an aggressive person is blank, we might see varying degrees as to what an aggressive person looks like when asking participants or other individuals to describe what's truly aggressive. This was at the heart of personality differences, Kelly argued. Different constructs allowed us to predict the world in different ways. He said all of us, being scientists, are constantly creating these, constantly trying to make sense of our worlds. But Kelly didn't stop there, like many of his predecessors. Instead, what he then went on to do was try to prove this particular idea through research. He didn't have a ton of time to do it, but he was able to train some research assistants who went on to become graduate students and become professionals within the career, within the area of personality, that did finally break this threshold. Did allow us to start pursuing things in much more scientific terms. That's what we're going to focus the rest of this class on. These researchers that went on to follow in Kelly's footsteps were later known as social cognitive psychologists. We talked about them briefly when we talked about social psychology, but when we're talking about social cognitive psychologists in the fields of personality, what we're looking at is an attempt to understand and explain a person's behavior based on what they've encountered in their social world. What these theorists argue is that when we're looking at a human being, what we're looking at is a person who's constantly learning. They're learning what to do in different situations, learning how to make sense of different situations, and they're learning, more importantly, what to want in different situations. In essence, we're constantly trying to develop skills that will allow us to adapt, to, be successful in specific situations that we intend to encounter in our future. This idea of social cognitive psychology in the field of personality is something many, many people have started studying nowadays. Two of the more prominent people that started this concept of social cognition was Albert Bandura and Walter Mischel. Bandura is usually credited with being the first person to really introduce the basic concepts of social cognition and how they apply to personality. One of his big ideas that he presented was that when we look at a person's behaviors, when we look at their personality, what we should probably assume is that those personality behaviors or personality linked behaviors are not just things that come out of nowhere. Instead, they're learned. When we see people get rewarded in our environment for doing something, we do it. When we see them getting punished, we don't do it. And he tried to prove this with a very, very groundbreaking experiment that involves something that we don't see much nowadays. Back in his time, they were very popular. We called these things Bobo dolls. In this experiment, what he would do is have children come into a room and watch a woman pummel and beat up a tiny clown. Then he would see the woman either get punished, or the children, would see the woman get punished for doing this, or rewarded. And afterwards, the kids would then be allowed to play with this clown. And what Bandura found in his experiments was that when kids did not beat up the clown, when the woman did not get rewarded for beating up the clown, the kids did not beat up the clown. But when this female, this model, was rewarded for it, the kids display aggressive behaviors, but they embellished. They added things that the woman did not do. And to get a sense of the results in Bandura's research, what I'd like you to do is go to that link listed below and watch a video, a very short one, of one of the children in Bandura's study to see how elaborate the aggressive behavior could be after just a few minutes of exposure to fairly mild aggression by the adult model. Again, in addition to the work of Albert Bandura, there's one other person that we credit this social cognitive movement to. And that's somebody that was actually a student of George Kelly's. His name was Walter Mischel. Mischel stressed that when we're looking at an individual, what we're looking at is somebody that's trying to predict what's going on, just like Kelly did. But he said what we're doing is looking at our social world, looking at our environment to figure out what we should expect from something and how we should make sense of the environments that we find ourselves in. So if we say, talk about a party, for example. If you walk into a party and you're very introverted, you're very shy, you walk into that party assuming that this is going to be a horrible experience. You're going to be uncomfortable. The worst thing that could happen is that people are going to start paying attention to you, not speaking well, or not knowing what to do. If you go to that same party and you're extroverted, you're going to perceive that as a very enticing environment. Something that will allow you to talk to many people, get to know strangers that you've never met before. And what Mischel argued is that the way we deal with these environments is by developing what he called competencies. Skill sets that allow us to engage in those environments that we perceive. So for the introvert who walks to the party, they might develop competencies to help them avoid that pain and that anxiety, that allow them to, say, hide from the rest of the crowd, not make eye contact, minimize the tension and the conflict. Or the person who's very extroverted perceives a party as fun, might develop competencies that allow them to meet more people, to be the center of attention, to get as many phone numbers or get to know as many people as possible. This was what Mischel thought was really the basis of differences in personality. Not just seeing the world in different ways, but developing skills to help us really master the environments that we come up with. And this idea, Mischel, again, just like with other social cognitive psychologists, tried to prove it. In his research, what he argued is that we can look for competency differences in children as young as, say, 4 or 5 years of age. And he didn't only argue this, he tried to prove it. The study that's now become exceptionally famous. It's something we called a delay of gratification study. And in this study, children were kind of given a very specific set of instructions. They were sat down at a table and placed in front of a marshmallow. Now, in the original study, it was just one marshmallow placed in front of them, and they were told if they could resist that marshmallow, they'd be allowed to have 2 marshmallows a little bit later. In the second rendition of this study, they were actually placed in front of 3 Oreo cookies and told that if they could resist one, they could have all 3 later on. And what Mischel was interested in seeing was how the kids reacted to this. Whether or not they were frustrated, angry, excited, and also what skills the kids developed to help them resist that temptation. And what he found was that at the age of 5, 6, or 7, these kids were already displaying very dramatic differences in their behavior. In essence, some kids had developed competencies for this situation, and others hadn't. What I'd like you to do is go to this video, which is connected to this lecture, and watch some of the competencies that the kids are displaying. Because those competencies were really important. Because not only did they predict individual differences in that particular experiment, but we later went on to find that that predicted other things with those kids at the time. Namely, successful kids, popular kids were the ones that were capable of resisting that marshmallow. And what's even more interesting and more profound with Mischel's work is that when he followed up with these kids 20 years later, the same descriptions of most of these kids were again applied to them. So the ones that resisted the marshmallow at age 5 were also the ones that tended to go through college, have successful marriages, be very happy with their life and their job. Were the ones that couldn't, were the ones that didn't make it through high school or struggled throughout their entire educational career. They're the ones that had conflict with family members, were never really happy with what was going on. There's always individual differences, of course, but the fact that there were stark contrasts in Michelle's studies between people that could and couldn't resist a marshmallow and many other categories of life really led us to accept this notion of what social cognitive psychologists were arguing, that our social environment, what we learn, can indeed have a very, very strong impact on who we are as an individual. This marks the end of today's lecture on personality. Well, the first half of today's lecture on personality. In the second half, we're going to be transitioning from the theories to cognition and personality, and instead transfer over to current research on how we actually differentiate people in personality. Notice when we talk about what we've looked at so far, we spent considerable time looking at explanations for why we have personality characteristics. We've also focused a lot on past experiences, what makes us different as a result of what we've encountered before. I promise you in the next class, talking about causes, talking about our experiences, we'll take a back seat to looking at the now, looking at how we can differentiate people from a moment-to-moment basis. If you haven't read already, make sure you do. And I'll see you all very soon.